Alright, this begins Chapter 3, Lesson 7, dealing with multiplication properties. But before we go into multiplication properties, I want to make sure you have a good understanding of Lesson 3.6, dealing with multiplying two-digit numbers. So I want you to go through and pause the video, solve these 6 problems, and actually pause the video, solve them, because it's going to help. The more work you do on the front end, the more you're going to get out of these lessons if you're actually solving the problems and doing the work. So the first problem is 46 times 17. Second problem is 78 times 57. Third problem is 92 times 83. Fourth problem is 56 times 325. Fifth problem is 607 times 82. And our sixth problem is 344 times 95. So pause the video, go ahead, solve it through, see what you get, and then we can compare answers. Because when I go through and I solve these problems for 46 times 17, I get 782. For 78 times 57, I get 4,446. For 92 times 83, well, if I do 90 times 80, doing an estimate, I'm going to get 5,600, and when I actually multiply it through, I get 7,636. And 56 times 325, that gives me 18,200. Oops, one too many zeros. There we go. And when I do 607 times 82, I get 49,774. And when I do 344,000 times 95, well, if I up that to 100, that'd be 3,440. And when I multiply that actually out, I get 32,680. So hopefully you were able to come with answers that were the same as mine, and if not, make sure that you take time to solve through and figure out why it is you got what you got wrong. So today, dealing with multiplication strategies and different multiplication properties, these are going to be very similar to the addition properties that we dealt with. And so I have, oh, sorry, I just moved the whole camera for you. It's not very good. The first one that we have is the associative property. And if you remember from the associative property, the way in which the factors are grouped does not change the product. So if I have 9 times 2 times 5, that is the same as, oops, I don't want that, 9 times 2 times 5. So here I get 18 times 5. Here I get 9 times 10. Here I get 190. Here I get 190. It all works out the same. Just how you get the answer is different, but the answer is still the same. So that is the associative property. Notice the associative property has to do with these grouping symbols, whether they be parentheses or brackets or fill in the blank. And then the next one we have is the commutative property. And the commutative property states that the order of the factors multiplied does not matter. So 4 times 8 is the same thing as 8 times 4, and they both equal 32. So we know that these work out to be the same. Notice this has to do with order. This has to do with grouping. Commutative has to do with order, and they're the same rules apply as they did with the addition properties. We're just giving them a slightly different look because we're dealing with multiplication. And the last one we're going to deal with today is the identity property. And everyone loves the identity property when it has to do with multiplication. It's one of your favorite multiplication problems, because any number times 1 equals that number. So, for example, 3 times 1 equals 3. 32 times 1 equals 32. 2. There we go. 1 million times 1 equals 1 million. So, that's the identity property. So we've got these 3 properties here. Move up so you can see them all. We've got these 3 properties here. We've got the associative property has to do with grouping, the commutative property that has to do with order, the identity property which has to do with multiplying by 1. So let's clear this out and let's practice and see if you can identify which property this is. So if I do 6 times 100, and I say that that is equal to, no, hold on, times 7. So 6 times 100 times 7, and I'm saying that that is the same as 6 times 7 times 100. What property is being listed here? And let's try this one too at the same time. While you're thinking on that, I'll write out the second one. So here I have 8 times 2 times 3. And I'm saying that is the same as 8 times 2 times 3. Notice here, I have no grouping symbols. I'm not multiplying anything times 1. So it's not the associative, and it's also not the identity. The only one I have left then is the commutative property, and I'm going to specify this is the commutative property of multiplication, because all our properties here are dealing with multiplication. Now, looking back at this one, here I have 8 times 2 times 3 is equal to 8 times the quantity 2 times 3. I have these grouping symbols, so that's going to be my key, that it's the associative property of multiplication. And the great thing about these properties is these properties allow us to solve things easier, or even go to the point of solving them in our head. So if you have a coach has 2 groups of 16 players in each group, and each player had to score 5 goals, and we can use the multiplication properties to find out how many goals each kid scored. So I have 2 times 16 times 5. That's the original problem. So what I'm going to use is I'm going to use these properties to solve these. 2 times 16 times 5 is kind of hard to do in my head, but if I can change the numbers, I'm going to change it so that it's 2 times 5 times 16. And that is the commutative property. And I'm specifying that it's multiplication. Now that I have this 2 times 5 next to each other, I can say I'm going to multiply 2 times 5 first. And by adding those grouping symbols, I am now doing the associative property of multiplication. And then I go through and I multiply and I get 10 times 16. Didn't like my 10. And that is just multiplying. And then 10 times 16 using our multiplication patterns gives me 160, and so then I am just simplifying. So that I can use these 2 properties to solve this, and I was able to do it in my head. No paper and pencil necessary. And that's kind of the goal with all of these properties, that you can start solving these problems in your head and you don't have to always take out a paper and pencil or a calculator. So let's do another one. Brenda ran 45 minutes a day, 5 days a week for 20 weeks. Use the properties of multiplication to find the total number of minutes she ran. So the original problem is 45 times 5 times 20. So this is the original. So now I'm going to use these multiplication properties. I've already got 5 times 20 right next to each other, so I'm not going to bother moving them around. I'm just going to say I'm going to multiply 5 times 20 first. And so that I add in those grouping property, those grouping symbols, that is the associative. And then I go ahead and I can take 45 times, this is 100, and all that is multiplying. And then 45 times 100 is using our patterns that we just tack on 2 zeros at the end. It's 4,000, and that's just simplifying. And so she ran for 4,500 minutes. So what I'm going to do for you is I'm going to put a couple examples up on the board here, and then I would like you to go ahead and solve them, and then make sure that you're stating what properties are you using to solve these problems. So we'll put one there, and oh, I might not have enough room, so I might put another one down here. Alright, so go through and solve this one first, and then make sure you're noting what properties you're using. Because when I go through it, I look at it and say, oh, well, 5 times 2 is right next to each other. I'm going to do 5 times 2 first, times 34. And that property is the associative property, because I'm adding in those grouping symbols. Now I have 10 times 34, and that's just multiplying. And 10 times 34 is 340. When I look at this problem down here, I've got a 2 and I've got a 50. I'm like, oh, that's so much easier to multiply in my head. So I'm going to have to use my commutative property to make it 2 times 50 times 51. So that's my commutative. And so then I'm going to multiply 2 times 50 together first, times 51, and that is, I can do that because I know what the associative property is. Sorry, I'm spelling associative wrong. And then 2 times 50 is 100 times 51, and that is, I just multiplied there. And then using my multiplication, I'm going to do 51 with 2 zeros tacked onto the end, 5,500, and then it's just to simplify. And that's how we solve those problems. So make sure that when you have a good understanding of what is the associative property, what is the commutative property, and then make sure always the one that we haven't really done much with is that other property, which is the identity property. And that just means anything times 1. And then make sure you can take problems that are like this and solve step by step, justifying each step. Show your steps, identify. So when you look at your math problems and you get to problems like 15 through 26, where you use the multiplication properties, you show your steps, you identify the properties that you use. If you're not taking the time to do that, you are only hurting yourself for in the future. So good luck with those problems. And that concludes